Today we're continuing A Long Way from Chicago, the second half of Chapter 3, coming up next. Welcome to Read with Maren, where I share with you fun, wholesome, and inspiring stories that you can share with the whole family. Stay to the end. I'll share my thoughts with you and the inevitable blooper. If you remember where we left off in Chapter 3, the sheriff had just seen Grandma Dowdel, Mary Alice, and Joey rowing along in his boat full of catfish. Let's begin. And Grandma saw them as if for the first time. She seemed to lose control of the oars, and her mouth fell open in shock. Mary Alice was already shocked and didn't have to pretend. I didn't know where to look. Some of the business community were so far gone, they just stared back unbelieving. They thought they owned this stretch of the creek. A few, seeing Grandma and Mary Alice were of the opposite sex, scrambled to hide themselves behind the others. But you never saw anybody looking as scandalized as Grandma was at the old birds in their union suits, and less. She was speechless as her gaze passed over them all, recognizing everybody. It was this silent scene until Sheriff O.B. Dickerson found his voice. "Stop in the name of the law!" he bellowed. "That's my boat!" Before the Rod and Gun Club was out of sight, Grandma had regained control of the oars. She rowed on as none of this had ever happened. The sun was beating down, so she didn't push herself. After all, the sheriff couldn't chase us downstream. We were in his boat. Around another bend, and a flock of turtles sunning on old stumps, Grandma pulled for the remains of an old dock. We tied up there, and now we were out of the boat, climbing a bluff. Grandma led, dragging the net of catfish. I was in the rear, doing my best with the picnic hamper. Mary Alice was between us, watching where she walked. She was scareder of snakes than she let on, if you ask me. An old house without a speck of paint on it stood tall on the bluff. Its outbuilding had caved in, and the privy stood at an angle. They were still prairie chickens around in those days, and they were pecking at the dirt. Otherwise, the place looked lifeless. Rags hung in the windows. The porch overlooking the creek had fallen off. Grandma tramped around to the far side of the house. She dropped her fish on the ground and waved us inside. Even in full daylight, the place looked haunted. I didn't want to go in, but Mary Alice was already marching through the door, so I had to. "Is anybody inside?" I whispered to Grandma as I lugged the hamper past her. "Nobody but Aunt Puss Chapman," she said, like anybody would know that. It had been a fine house once. A wide black walnut staircase rose to a landing window, with most of its stained glass still in. But it was creepy here, dim and dusty. Smelled funny, too. We went into a room piled up with furniture, and then one of the chairs spoke. "Where you been, girl?" Mary Alice flinched, but the old woman lost in the chair was staring straight at Grandma. I'm calling her girl? She was by many years the oldest person we had ever seen up until then. Bald as an egg, but she needed a shave. And not a tooth in her head. "Who's them children with you?" she demanded of Grandma. "Just kids I found along the creek bank," Grandma said to our surprise. "They was fishing." "I don't know as I want them in my house." Aunt Puss Chapman sent us a mean look. "Do they steal?" "Nothing you've got," Grandma said under her breath. "Talk up, girl. You mumble. I've spoken to you about that before." She pulled her shawl closer, though it was the hottest day of the year. "I'm hungry. You hightailed it out of here after breakfast, and I ain't seen the hide or hoof mark of you since." "She ain't seen me for a week," Grandma mumbled to us, "but she forgets." Then she called out to Aunt Puss. "Catfish and fried potatoes and onions, vinegar slaw, and a pickled peach apiece. The more of the same for your supper." "I suppose that beats starving," snapped Aunt Puss. "Hop to it, girl. Stir your stumps." I thought I might faint again. Nobody could talk to Grandma like that and live. She led us back to an old-time kitchen. It was in bad shape, but well-stocked. Big sacks of potatoes, onions, cornmeal, things in cans. And we'd brought a full hamper to add to Aunt Puss's larder. I had to fire up the stove with a bunch of kindling while Grandma and Mary Alice went to work on the potatoes and onions. Mary Alice was in as big a daze as I was. Grandma, is that nasty old lady your aunt? I stopped to listen. If she was, that made her our great aunt. No, I was a hired girl before I was married, Grandma said. Lived in this house and fetched and carried for her and slept in the attic. You had a room in the attic? No, I just slept up there. I had a bed tick with straw in it and changed it every spring. I haven't always lived in the luxury that you see me now. What did she pay you, Grandma? Pay? She didn't pay me a plug nickel, but she fed me. I thought about that. And now you feed her, I said, but Grandma didn't reply. We cleaned the fish on a plate table outdoors. I didn't much care for it. Made me kind of sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. She had her own quick way of doing that, but every time it sounded like the fish screamed. She put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the head of anything looking back at me. And catfish have mustaches for some reason, which is just plain weird. Finally, Mary Alice took the rusty hatchet out of my hand and whomp! She'd bring down the blade and that fish head would go flying. Mary Alice was so good at it, I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobwebby gasolier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table. Without her hat, her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We had been working like a whole pack of bird dogs. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. These fish taste muddy. Yuns catch 'em? Yes. No. What did you use for bait? Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. Cheese. Worms, Mary Alice said more wisely. Since we couldn't get together on our story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. You chillin' still in school? We nodded. Do they whoop ya? Do they what? Mary Alice asked. Do they paddle your behind when you need it? Aunt Puss looked interested. If they did, I'd quit school, Mary Alice said, who had just completed the 3rd grade. They whooped that girl raw. Aunt Puss pointed her fork down the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all about the same age. She hadn't noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It would have just mixed up old Aunt Puss. That's when she came to work for me. They'd throwed her out of school. Aunt Puss peered down the table. Tell 'em why. We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she had been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. I forgot, she said. I don't. It was because you wadded up your underwear drawers to stop up the flue on the stove and smoke out the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education. Working for you was an education, Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard. It took us another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. Where do you think you're off to now? She called out as we trooped through the front hall. Down to the sty to slop the hogs, Grandma called back. Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle, and I've spoken to you about that before. Get on out of here. Let the door hit you where the dog bit you. Outdoors, I said. Does she have dogs? She used to. She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but don't know it. How could she? She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat. You take her food every week, don't you, Grandma? Generally, a good big roast chicken. She can gum that for days. Grandma turned down the lane. It keeps her out of the poor farm and gives me a quiet day in the country. It's a fair swap." Then her jaw clenched on the way. "But it's my private business between her and me, and don't tell anyone my private business." We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper, heavy with clean catfish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the trees in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go straight up to bed. But Grandma said, "Skin down to the cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke." I whimpered, but she was turning on Mary Alice. "And you and me's going to fry up a couple pecks of potatoes to go with the fish. There won't be nothing to it. I peeled the potatoes this morning before you two was up." We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with the potatoes and onions at the other end, popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and the night was at the windows before we finished up. "Now, get down every platter I own." Then she sent me for the card table I'd used for my jigsaw puzzle of the Charles A. Lindbergh. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. We lugged it all the way across the road and up to the Wabash Railroad, right out of the way, and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and the open beer bottles stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them good feed and beer to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that dragged to the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, then 5 or 6, then a bunch standing around the table, eating with both hands, sharing out the beer. They didn't say much. They didn't thank her, but she wasn't there looking for thanks. She had taken off her overalls and put on the same wash dress, but she had tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from her bun in the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, working her mouth. Then we saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies coming along behind to keep them drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now with his badge on and his belt full of bullets riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. Okay, break it up," he said, elbowing through the drifters. Then he came to Grandma. "Dag-nabbit, Miss Dowdel, you're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice. Now what do you think you're doing?" "I'm giving these boys the first eats they've had today." "Or yesterday," a drifter said. "Mrs. Dowdel, let me explain something to you," the sheriff bawled. "We don't want to feed these loafers. We want them out of town." "They are out of town." Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. "The town stops there. We're in the county." "Yes, and I'm the sheriff of the county," O.B. Dickerson bellowed. "You're in my jurisdiction." "Do tell," Grandma said. "Run me in." The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson's deputies saw they were outnumbered. "Mrs. Dowdel," the sheriff boomed, "I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance?" he said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. "Out of the old trap in the Salt Creek," Grandma remarked. "Same as you get yours." O.B. Dickerson's eyes bulged. "You accusing me, the sheriff of Piatt County, of running fish traps?" He poked his own chest with a big pudgy finger. "Not this morning," Grandma replied. "You was too drunk." The drifters chuckled. "And talking about this morning," the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness, "you stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdel. You could go up for that." "Oh, Well, the boat. Grandma made a little gesture with the spatula. You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule, I take it back where you tied it up. But of course I couldn't do that this morning. How could I row these grandkids of mine back past the Rod and Gun Club? They'd already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind, drunk, and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch, and I don't know what all. It's like to have marked this girl for life. Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in the big apron looking drooped and damaged. I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. You don't want her to develop one of them complexes you hear about. Whoa, the deputies muttered behind Sheriff Dickerson. Earl T. Askew stepped back and said into his ear, "Oh, B, let's just let sleeping dogs lie. I got my hands full with Mrs. Askew as it is." The sheriff simmered, but said, "Okay, Earl, if you say so." The sheriff and his posse were on retreat now, but he had to cover himself. "Mrs. Dowdel," pulling a long face, he said, "they's things I can overlook, but it seems like you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea that there's a law against that on the books." "Go look it up, O.B.," Grandma said. "See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, all the evidence is ate up." And of course it was. The drifters had wolfed down the last morsel. With a small finger, Mary Alice pointed to both platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered in the air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving down the track, and the deputies were headed back into town. O.B. Dickerson spit on the gravel, swung around, and followed them, his boots grinding in the gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as we worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. "The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget." Then after our quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road. Then, after our quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road under a silver dollar moon. We'll stop there for now. I love watching and learning how Grandma Dowdel takes charge of things that she sees as wrong or people that need help and just does it, no matter what anybody thinks. That's a lesson we could all learn in this life. And it goes along with the idea of looking for good in the world. We need to create it. We need to do what we can to help others and to stand for what we believe is right. Always, always look for the good in the world. And if you can't find it, create it yourself. We'll see you next time. The cheese one's on the back. It's okay. These things will do happen. If you recall where we left off. Okay, I've got it. Let me just do it. Today we're reading A Long Way from Chicago. I don't have it clearly. Today we're continuing on with I can't remember the name of the book, A Long Way from Chicago. Okay, we're going to do this again.